Okay, so it started recording, so I'm assuming that Zaina can hear us even if we can't hear her, but that shouldn't be an issue. Um, Sana, whenever you're ready to start. I would just say one thing. Omar, considering that you said that Mariam is just fixing her internet and she should be on in a minute, should we just wait a minute, or is your call that we just get down with
Oh,
it?
let's start. In worst case, if I can go before her, we can just switch the order.
Perfect. Sana, whenever you're ready.
Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to thank everyone who came here to contribute to today's workshop. I'm going to introduce each speaker individually in a bit, but I'd also like to thank everyone who took the time to attend. Firstly, I'm going to be introducing myself, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about NNUDC, DS, sorry. Also, like what I'm going to be doing is introducing each speaker, talk about their achievements a little bit, like a little profile. And I'm going to be, last but not least, introducing Hamza, who is going to moderate our event for today. So first of all, I'm going to be introducing myself. My name is Sana Aslan, as you all can see. I'm from Nablus. I graduated from An Najah National University, and I've been on the team for the last 4 years, ever since its founding in 2017. I'm also a medical imaging technician right now. I graduated with a medical imaging bachelor's. So first off, I'd like to say that our society is honored to collaborate with the European Universities Debating Championship for 2021, Adjudication Core, and Organizing Committee to bring this workshop to every one of you today. Our team started competing internationally in 2018, and since the pandemic, we have participated in over a dozen European, Asian, North American online tournaments and spars. So throughout our international participation, we've long noticed an expertise gap and misunderstandings around the context of Palestine, like within many debate rounds, as well as in many tournaments. We hope that this workshop will help bring a deeper and a more nuanced understanding of the realities on the ground today. So having said that, I'd like to start introducing the speakers. So we have Mariam Barghouti, who is not with us until now, but she will be joining very soon. Mariam is a writer, researcher, and a journalist whose work has been featured in Al-Jazeera English, The Guardian, BBC, Huffington Post, the New York Times, Middle East Monitor, Newsweek, and the International Business Times, among others. Mariam has a master's in sociology and global change from the University of Edinburgh and a bachelor's in English literature from Birzeit University in the West Bank. And she's going to be joining us today. Now I'd like to introduce Omar Shakir. You're very welcome. We're very honored to have you today. He is the Israel and Palestine Country Director for Human Rights Watch, and prior to his current role, he was a Bertha Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights. Omar holds a Juris Doctorate from Stanford Law School, Master's in Arab Studies from Georgetown University School of Foreign Affairs, and a Bachelor's in International Relations from Stanford. Very welcome. And we also have Dr. Tareq Baconi. He is a senior analyst for Israel and Palestine at the International Crisis Group. His writings and analysis have been featured in Al-Ghad and Al-Quds, al-Arabi, and in English in the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, The Guardian, the New York Times, BBC, amongst others. He is the author of Hamas Contained, The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance. Tareq received his Bachelor's of Science in Chemical Engineering, Master's in International Relations in Cambridge, and PhD in Philosophy, International Relations and Affairs from King's College, London. Previously served as a visiting scholar at both Columbia University's Middle East Institute and the European Council on Foreign Relations. We are very, very honored to have you here with us today. I see that Mariam joined. You're very welcome. We already did the introductions, but I just wanted to personally welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Hamza for moderating today's events, and I'd like to do a brief introduction on him as well. So Hamza holds the title of the best speaker at EUDC 2020, Oxford 2020, Yale 2021, and fifth speaker and finalist at WDC 2021. He is the founder of LSE Public Debate Program, the organizer of LSE First Global Activist Forum, and has interviewed and hosted numerous politicians, policymakers, and journalists across South Asia. And he received his master's in international public diplomacy at LSE and is currently a Gleitzman Leadership Fellow for Social Change at Harvard Kennedy School. We're very honored to have you here with us today. I'd like to pass the mic to Hamza right now. You can start whenever you feel ready. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you, Sana, for that great introduction. Watch me live it down over the next few minutes. Just a brief housekeeping note in terms of how we're going through this discussion. So firstly, we'll have a set of opening remarks by our speakers, following which we will have a moderated discussion, which should last roughly 50 to 60 minutes, following which we will have questions and answers from many of you who've joined into the call. You can simply put those questions in. I would only ask that you keep them brief, you keep them respectful, and you keep them relevant to the expertise of our panelists and the general discussion. And if you are indeed comfortable, feel free to give your name and your institutional status, whether that is professional or academic, alongside your question. We will now get into the opening remarks. We will first have Mariam come in and deliver her opening remarks. Please, Mariam, the floor is yours.
Okay, sorry, the mute was on. First off, thank you all for having me. I appreciate this panel, and it's humbling to be amongst you all. In terms of for my own opening remarks, it's kind of to present it in a the framework of Israeli settler colonialism, just because also right now we are recognizing that what is happening here is settler colonialism. So what does that really mean for Palestine when we say what's happening is the settler colonial ethnic cleansing? What's happening is that a state, the Israeli state, was legitimized despite it being built through massacring Palestinians. The Zionist project moved forward under the emblem of a land without a people for a people without a land. And that is what erasure is. That is what ethnic cleansing is. It is the denial of the existence of a population so you can alleviate yourselves from the accountability of the crimes committed, necessarily committed, in order to build another nation or another state on top of it. So settler colonial ethnic cleansing is basically driving out Palestinians in order to build the Israeli state. And this doesn't necessarily mean massacring and killing us or carpet bombing Gaza or the massacres that happened in 1948 and 1947 under Operation Dalit by the terrorist organizations of Haganah and Irgun. Palestinians to the boundaries. It is pushing them to the edge. It is denying us our economic independence. It is denying us access to our resources. It is pushing youth to a point of feeling like this place is unlivable, whether from opportunities or from just being able to carry on basic daily needs. So this is what we say when we say settler colonialism. It is a replacement. It is a driving out. Palestinians aren't fleeing. They're fleeing something. And that is the violence and the brutality and the criminal war crimes of the Zionist movement, which became, again, legitimized under the framework of statehood as Israel. But for us, this is still the same apartheid system, the same framework of denying the existence of an entire people that we continue to live under. It's 73 years. It's been 73 years. And as technology became more advanced, they couldn't just go and massacre entire villages. They had to slow down the process of this settler expansion. So this is why we also speak a lot about the settlements within the West Bank. But for us also, Haifa is a settlement. Tel Aviv is a settlement. And these are things we tend to forget or we're scared to say. So I'll leave it there as we jump to our other panelists.
Thank you, Mariam. And we'll definitely get into a discussion of what settler colonialism manifests itself as in status quo, what it means to push Palestinians to the boundaries, perhaps both geographically and politically. So thank you for your remarks. I will now have Omar come in. Please, Omar.
Thanks so much, Hamza, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to join with all of you. Debate was a really formative experience for me, and so it's really awesome to have the chance to contribute to everybody else's experiences. What I'd like to do in my sort of 10 minutes to talk about the human rights situation on the ground today. It's impossible to do that in 10 minutes. So I'll really focus mostly on a recent Human Rights Watch report. And look forward to tackling other human rights issues in the discussion. So, for many in the international community, several widely held assumptions have sort of underlined the way they look at the situation on the ground today. And that's why maybe when you hear Mariam's presentation, some of this may strike as discordant with what you know about Israel-Palestine, because you've long heard that the occupation is temporary, that the peace process will soon end abuses on the ground, that Palestinians have meaningful control and sovereignty over their lives, especially in the West Bank and Gaza, or even that Israel is an egalitarian democracy within its borders. These assumptions have obscured the reality of Israel's discriminatory rule over Palestinians today. Today, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there's a single government that primarily rules over this area, the Israeli government. And in this area, two groups of roughly equal size live, Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. Israeli policy throughout these areas has sought to methodically privilege Jewish Israelis and systematically repress Palestinians at varying degrees of intensity. Human Rights Watch's recent 213-page report, A Threshold Crossed, documents and evaluates Israel's treatment of Palestinians across Israel and the occupied territory. It's based on years of Human Rights Watch reporting, new case studies conducted for this report, and many other areas. We then compared the facts that we documented around established international law around discrimination. And under international law, there is a universal prohibition against severe discriminatory oppression or apartheid. While the term was coined in relation to South Africa, international treaties define it as a universal legal term and as a crime against humanity, defined both under its own 1973 convention, as well as the 1998 Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court. As a crime against humanity, apartheid refers to three things. One is systematic oppression by one group of people over another. Second is an intent by one group of people to dominate another. And third is inhumane acts by the dominant group over the marginalized group. So intent to dominate, systematic oppression, inhumane acts. There's a related crime against humanity under international law of persecution, which refers to severe abuses of fundamental rights when combined with discriminatory intent. So when Human Rights Watch applied the facts that we documented about the treatment of Palestinians against this law, we concluded that Israeli authorities today are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Let me briefly lay out at a high level the findings of this report. We based that conclusion on, first of all, an intent or policy by the Israeli government across the areas it rules to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. And secondly, the particularly grave repression that takes place in the occupied territory. In the first part of the analysis, the report lays out the extensive evidence to show the way in which this policy manifests. It manifests largely by an Israeli government effort to ensure control over demographics and land by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. What this means in practice is pursuit of the maxim of maximum land, minimum Palestinians, right? And openly taking policies to combat the demographic threat that Palestinians pose. This policy takes different forms. For example, inside Israel proper, the Israeli government has a policy that it talks about of Judaizing the Negev and the Galilee. These are areas that are about 2/3 of the land of Israel, and where Israeli law permits hundreds of small Israeli towns and communities to exclude Palestinians from living there. And this is after years of land confiscations and attracting Jews to live there. In Jerusalem, which encompasses occupied East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, the government planning document sets out a goal of, quote, maintaining a solid Jewish majority in the city, and talks about pursuing densification and thickening of Palestinian areas. They even set out target demographic ratios they hope to maintain. This is policy that is not just in words, but is supplemented by actions. Move over to the rest of the West Bank. You have decades of Israeli government policy documents that talk about, for example, plans to settle the land between the Arab minority population centers and their surroundings, noting that doing so would, quote, remove any trace of doubt about our intent to control Judea and Samaria, the terms they use for the West Bank, forever. And this has been backed up by years of mass land grabs and infrastructure, roads, water, electricity, connecting settlements to Israel proper. And in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli government, while it withdrew its ground forces and settlers in 2005, continues to control Gaza via other means, and has pursued a policy of what they describe as separation between Gaza and the West Bank, essentially turning the 25-by-7 mile, 40-by-11 kilometer Gaza into a demographic receptacle to hold 2 million Palestinians that do not count against, in their books, the demographic calculus of Jews and Palestinians across the areas it hopes to control. Israel justifies many of these abuses in the name of security, but many of the abuses at the core of apartheid and persecution, for example, blocking family reunification for Palestinians, the denial of building permits, land expropriation, has no legitimate security justification. And even where security is a consideration, like the movement restrictions, Israel has pursued a policy that so goes beyond what international law authorizes that it actually no more justifies apartheid than it would other crimes against humanity. This amounts to a discriminatory intent, one of the elements of persecution, or an intent to dominate, one of the elements of apartheid. The second part of our report looks at the grave repression in the occupied territory that rises to the threshold of systematic oppression and inhumane acts, which are part of apartheid, and severe abuses of fundamental rights, which is the second element of persecution. Let me give a few examples of this policy. And again, we have hundreds of footnotes, pages to document this. In the West Bank, the Israeli government subjects Palestinians to draconian military rule while governing Jewish Israelis living in the same territory under Israeli civil law, which is more rights respecting. What does that mean? That means an Israeli Palestinian living in the West Bank, say Mariam and somebody who might live across the street who's Jewish, if they commit the same crime, they're tried under different courts where they have different due process rights, and they could receive different penalties for the very same crime. It also means that plunder of land from Palestinians in the West Bank, more than 1/3 of the West Bank has actually been confiscated from Palestinians, including in East Jerusalem. And 99+% of this land redistributed for civilian use has gone to settlers who live in settlements, which are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention and a war crime. In addition, you have a separate and unequal allocation of permits, resources, roads, water. Many of the same dynamics in East Jerusalem. And we can talk more about how that's manifested in the recent events in Sheikh Jarrah. And in the Gaza Strip, where the Israeli government for the past 14 years has imposed a generalized travel ban on the 2 million people living there. So nobody can move in or out except if you fit within a list of narrow humanitarian exemptions. There's also sweeping restrictions on movement, on the movement of goods, which means that the economy has been decimated. 80% of people rely on humanitarian aid. The majority of Palestinians spend the majority of their day without electricity, while Jewish Israelis, wherever they live, have full access to electricity. And of course, there's also the serious issues around movement restrictions in the West Bank, where you have nearly 600 checkpoints that Palestinians have to go through and other closure obstacles, where you have a separation barrier built largely on Palestinian land, where you have a permit regime that requires a Palestinian, again, like Mariam, to get a permit to enter large parts of the West Bank, while Jewish Israelis living in the same territory have largely unfettered movement. You have, in addition, coercive policies in East Jerusalem and in the majority of the West Bank under exclusive Israeli control, where Palestinians effectively can't get a building permit, and thousands of homes have been demolished for lacking a permit, where between 2016 and 2018, the Israeli government, according to government data, issued 100 times more demolition orders than building permits for Palestinians. And to take one last example, you have the fact that the 4.7 million Palestinians in the West Bank lack basic civil rights, and in Gaza, free speech, assembly, or any meaningful say over the government that rules over their lives. And of course, there are many other examples of severe discrimination, even inside Israel's borders, that reflect the intent to dominate. Take, for example, the situation in the Negev, inside Israel, where there are 90,000 Palestinian Bedouins that live in communities that are not recognized by the Israeli government, that don't receive basic services, that face regular home demolitions from homes that they've lived in for decades, for generations. So I'll just conclude by saying that by finding crimes against humanity, I mean, these are among the most odious crimes under international law. Human Rights Watch has called on the international community to take action to end these abuses, including to investigate and prosecute those implicated and to end complicity in the crime. But let me sort of conclude with some basic truths about the reality. A 54-year occupation is not temporary. A 30-year stalled peace process isn't sufficient to dismantle systematic repression. Denying millions of Palestinians their fundamental rights solely because they're Palestinian and not Jewish is not simply a matter of abusive occupation. The first step to solving any problem is to diagnose it correctly. Apartheid is not a hypothetical or a future scenario, as former US presidents like Jimmy Carter or foreign ministers like John Kerry or even Israeli foreign prime ministers warned about. It is the present day reality for millions of Palestinians. It's not just Human Rights Watch that said this. You have several Israeli human rights groups, you have legal scholars, parliamentarians, US Congress people, 2 former Israeli ambassadors to South Africa, the former Secretary General of the UN, numbers of states, South Africa, Namibia, foreign ministers of France and Luxembourg. So the bottom line here is those who strive for Israeli and Palestinian peace, regardless of solutions, should recognize that reality for what it is and end the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution.
Thank you, Omar, for your work and that comprehensive yet harrowing overview. I'll now switch over to Tareq. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Hamza, and thank you, Omar and Mariam, and everyone behind the scenes who made this this panel possible. I'm very happy to be a part of this. What I want to try to do in my 10 minutes is to bring together the 2 threads that Mariam and Omar introduced. So Mariam with her overview of settler colonialism, and Omar with his with HRW's description and identification of apartheid in Palestine, to try to bring this to the current moment in which we're living. And I think in some ways, the past few months, the events of the past few months, particularly in Sheikh Jarrah, offer a very important microcosm to try to understand some of the dynamics which are underlying what Omar and Mariam have spoken about, and which can break some of the myths that many of the participants or attendees here might have been exposed to looking at media, particularly in the West. So Sheikh Jarrah specifically has been in the news over the past few months because of the expulsion of Palestinian families living in Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, in order to make room for Jewish settlers to move into those lands. Now, at its core, this process of dispossessing Palestinians to make room for Jewish settlers is the process that Mariam started this discussion talking about, which is that of settler colonialism. Fundamentally, this is a process that is focused on consolidating land and property for Jewish settlement by removing Palestinian inhabitants from that land. That is the same process that started before, at the turn of the century, before Israel was even recognized as a state, and continues to this day. This is a process that Palestinians refer to as the ongoing Nakba. Now, Sheikh Jarrah is particularly important because it is in East Jerusalem, which, as Omar identified, as under the framework of partition and the stalled peace process, is meant to be the capital of the future Palestinian state. Rather than that, East Jerusalem has been annexed by Israel after its occupation in 1967, and in 1980 was de jure annexed, which means it was legally recognized by Israel as the unified capital of the state of Israel. So Palestinians in East Jerusalem do not have official representation by the leadership of the Palestinians that are now officially sitting in the PLO and specifically in the PA in the West Bank. And I'll come to that in a second. But so we're looking here at a number of Palestinian inhabitants who are being expelled in order to demographically engineer a Jewish majority in the city that Israel is now or that Israel now recognizes as the unified capital of its state. Now, fundamentally, this is the apartheid that Omar is talking about, that through demographic engineering and through demographic manipulation, processes of settler colonialism, processes of Jewish settlement are actioned and permitted and allowed to be entrenched in the land between the river and the sea. Now, one of the myths that Sheikh Jarrah has also broken apart for us is the fact that Palestinians are represented by their leadership, that the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank or Hamas is talking on behalf of those Palestinians. And what we saw, instead of this reality, or instead of this myth, we saw a reality of Palestinian mobilization in their entirety, not just Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but also Palestinians in Israel itself and Palestinians in the diaspora, refugees mobilizing against the Jewish settlement that is happening in Jerusalem and the continued expulsion of Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah. The turning, in some ways, May and June burst the bubble that the international community holds on to when they think about Palestine, Israel as a partition reality, where we have the state of Israel on the one hand, and we have Palestine on the other, represented by the PLO, sometimes described also as a state of Palestine, that partition is a statement of both sides seeking to resolve the conflict. Now that myth was burst in May, June, when rather than that, we saw a non-partition reality, where we had, as Omar rightly described, a single state, and this is the state of Israel, which is the sole sovereign between the river and the sea, expelling Palestinians. And in response to that, we had Palestinians not just in the occupied territories, but across the entire land and in the diaspora mobilizing against that regime. Now that came at the heel of obviously the B'Tselem report on apartheid, Human Rights Watch report on apartheid, and decades of Palestinians before both these organizations talking about Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid. And at the heel of all of that, we come to this moment in time, our current moment in time, where we see the myth of partition breaking. We're no longer looking at this as Israel-Palestine. We're looking at this as a single entity, which is the state of Palestine, in which a settler colony has entrenched itself, and through the crime of apartheid, as well as other crimes, has managed to maintain its rule over Palestinians. Now, I want to sort of take the lens specifically to the Palestinian side of this discussion. Now, I started by saying that in Sheikh Jarrah, there was popular mobilization, and that was at the forefront of the events that happened in May and June. Palestinians at the moment are not only fighting Israeli apartheid, they're also fighting their own leadership that have become, through a process of political engagement, become co-opted into the system of Israeli apartheid. So when we're looking at specifically in the West Bank, the rule of the PA, or even in the Gaza Strip, Hamas's government, we see two entities, two governing authorities that are administering the rights of the Palestinian people under overarching Israeli military control. So often the narrative around Israel-Palestine is that the two parties just need to sit around the table and negotiate their way out of it, out of whatever conflict they're currently living in, when in truth, the Palestinian Authority has no sovereignty. It is not an embryo of a future state. It is by design, through the Oslo Accords, seen as a governing authority that is focused on the notion of autonomy, which means that Palestinians are given certain social services, certain rights, including the right to healthcare, education, and so on and so forth, but lack actual self-determination, lack the ability to determine their political future. Now, that is by design. That is what the Palestinian Authority is designed to do, and this is what it continues to do. And the murder of Nizar Bannat, who is an activist, who was an activist and a vocal critic of the PA, is just one example of how the PA acts in a way that suppresses any kind of resistance to its rule, but also any kind of political pluralism, as well as resistance to Israel and Israel's occupation. Those structures, which is the PA in the West Bank, and also the structure of the PA in the Gaza Strip, but that is currently governed by Hamas, those structures are not embryos of future statehood. And they are not representative of Palestinians and where the Palestinians are at, because even if they were ruled by a democratic leadership today, they would only be speaking on behalf of Palestinians in the occupied territories. That kind of fragmentation, in which we look at the Palestinian people through fragments, so let's say the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, is part and parcel of Israel's apartheid regime. This is how the Palestinian people are fragmented, by being placed in different legal units and legal categories, as well as by being confined to separate geographic areas and prevented from movement between them. And the events of May and June showed the fallacy of that, because rather than either Hamas or the PA speaking on behalf of the Palestinian people were speaking in different ways across different constituencies in their own efforts. Which brings a question of who represents the Palestinians today. Historically, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was established in 1964 as an organization that could represent the Palestinians. Now, theoretically, that institution is a very powerful institution in the sense that it is endowed with legal and diplomatic tools, because it's internationally recognized as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. At the same time, that institution, the PLO, through its own compromises in the 70s, accepted partition of the land of Palestine and ended up accepting the notion of recognizing obviously the state of Israel and limiting Palestinian statehood to 22% of historic Palestine, which is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, with East Jerusalem as its capital. Setting aside the fact that the peace process that the PLO compromised in the sake of, as Omar said, has stalled and has not produced those outcomes, at its core, the reality is that even that kind of platform that the PLO was established to create also didn't speak on behalf of the Palestinian people. It removed the Palestinian citizens of Israel from representation, putting them as a domestic issue within Israel. So rather than being seen as a Palestinian, as part of the Palestinian people, they were seen as a domestic Israeli issue facing institutional discrimination within Israel. And it left out the Palestinian refugees and their right of return to homes, which is now Israel. So even at its best, this vehicle that is meant to represent the Palestinians had already, by virtue of its compromise, already removed key constituencies of the Palestinian people that it was meant to be representing. So the argument here, of course, is that international law itself, and as Mariam started this discussion by saying, by legitimating the state of Israel and by legitimating the Nakba, essentially already accepted and legitimated the settler colonization of 78% of the land of Palestine, which is now the state of Israel. So what we see today, and this is where I'm going to end my 10 minutes, is a process of recalibration. I think both Palestinians, but also Israeli Jewish organizations, international organizations are breaking out of this framework of partition, which sees two sides to this conflict, which sees Israel on one side and the state in the making, which is Palestine on the other, and beginning to reframe this to understand it in the way that Palestinians have always understood it, which is that there's actually a single power here. And that power, even pre-state of Israel, was a power committed to the consolidation of territory for the exclusive use of Jewish settlement. And to do that, demographic manipulation is a prerequisite, and that entails obviously the dispossession of Palestinians. So rather than seeing this as a partition reality, the non-partition reality, which as Omar rightly said, is a regime of apartheid, is one where there's a single sovereign here, and that sovereign is committed to Jewish supremacy, dominating a single people. So whether they're Palestinians in Tel Aviv or Palestinians in refugee camps in Syria, they're facing different facets of the same regime. And that's what the uprisings are showing. And at the moment, that representation of Palestinians does not exist politically, even in the PLO, certainly not in the PA and Hamas. And it exists most in a way that's most representative on the Palestinian street.
Thank you, Tareq, Omar, and Mariam. And over the next hour, we're definitely going to get into how the interplay of internal, both Israeli and Palestinian politics affects your opening remarks and our discussion. We're also going to look at the US, the international community, how to get involved, how to not get involved, and then all the complexities within that. But before we do that, I just want to frame this discussion along two lines. So the first is that often when discussions like these are had, the chief charge that is leveled at many people who have this discussion is one from anti-Semitism. It is a discussion about how to level accusations against a government is to level accusations against a community, which comes with its own sense of hierarchy. I want to quickly walk through this because I think it interplays well with what Mariam is saying in terms of settler colonialism. It's not just about disabling criticism, it's to make criticism in the first place ethically and morally wrong in the first place. It's almost bad to say it as opposed to that you're just not allowed to say it. So I'm interested to hear what Mariam thinks about that in its discursive manifestation of settler colonialism and how perhaps that inhibits or impacts political mobilizations within Palestine when they are vying for change. And then we can get into a perhaps more granular discussion. But Mariam, go ahead.
Thank you, Hamza. I think this is a very important discussion because what Israel's been doing is weaponizing this argument of anti-Semitism in order to sustain its colonial project. What's worse is that the international community has been doing the same. Things like criminalizing movements like the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is essentially a nonviolent movement, right? So they keep saying, why won't Palestinians try nonviolent methods of resistance? Well, we do. And other than that, Palestinians have the right to resist and protect themselves. In the recent escalations from the Israeli settler colonial movement, we saw settlers in Yafa and Akka and Shifa Amro mark Palestinian homes as quote unquote Arab. You can't even say Palestinian. So they can be attacked in the future by settlers. More than this is to continue linking the Palestinian right to self-determination, to independence, to dignity, to life, to being anti-Semitic is sinister, it is manipulative, and it relies on the lack of information being provided to the international community. Now, we can't alleviate the international community from its role in perpetuating what is happening in Palestine. The main actors doing the violence are the Israeli settlers, whether they are in uniform as the army and police or not. But the way it continues to remain and it perpetuates across decades, 73 years since the creation of the State of Israel, and legitimization of this colonial project, you have had Palestinians constantly confronted, and instead we're being driven out. But what does the international community do? It sustains this culture of impunity. And this is how settler colonial endeavors remain. They remain by a culture of impunity. We've spent the UN since 1949 creating all these declarations of human rights. When is the time to enforce them? When is the time to actually adhere to everything that's being said? And this is what Israel relies on. It's this hesitation to hold it accountable, because holding it accountable now is linked with being anti-Semitic. But when Human Rights Watch dared to say the word apartheid, again, decades after Palestinians have been saying it, and thank you, Tareq, for also pointing this out, that we've been saying everything that's coming out from international human rights organizations and Israeli organizations. And it's time to take our voices, our testimonies, and our analysis as valid. We are not just the personal narratives. We are very well aware of what is happening, how it's happening, and what needs to be done for it to end. So these need to be taken into consideration. For 73 years, Israel has relied on the hesitation. When Human Rights Watch decided to say apartheid and persecution, Omar was deported. The director of in this region was deported by Israel. So that tells you also how much colonialism relies on concealment, hiding information. No abuser has ever said, yeah, I've done this, I've committed this crime, hold me accountable. It is demanded by those who are experiencing it, and you need community to actually hold them accountable. And this is why we keep telling the international community, you need to hold Israel accountable. It's not our own inability. It's that it continues to gang up on Palestinians with Israeli settlers at the expense of human rights. It's really time to stop sloganizing international law, to stop sloganizing the fact that we respect freedom and justice and liberty and the right to pursue life, and to actually enforce it. And if that means holding Israeli settlers who happen to be Jewish accountable, then so be it. We need to also stop linking that together. And this is where the argument of anti-Semitism comes. And this is what Israel has relied on, not just the erasure of Palestinians physically, but also from the narrative. That this is not a people fighting for their lives. This is not a people who, right now, I can be charged with walking in the street with friends, speaking politics. And that's what several students from Birzeit University were charged with, for things like speaking together, which is basically us unpacking our reality, for visiting the homes and families of martyrs. They've criminalized the word martyr, which is also something we've seen with the censorship on social media, because there is no understanding to what martyr means, a shaheed. Israel criminalized that. It doesn't tell you that it kills us, that it commits extrajudicial killings and says a suspect has been neutralized, and then releases at best an apology when it's proven otherwise. It doesn't tell you that. It tells you that basically we're all a bunch of terrorists and we're Hamas. And if it's not Hamas, it's PFLP. And if it's not PFLP, it was once Fatah. And if it's not Fatah, it was once the PLO. And now it's just being Palestinian. We saw the charges with Muna and Mohammed Al-Quds, 22, who just recently turned 23-year-olds. One of them was nationalistic sentiment. What is that nationalistic sentiment? Our right to say Palestinian? If you walk the streets of Jaffa, if you walk the streets of Haifa, if you walk all the Palestinian cities and towns that were dispossessed in 1948, the history has been erased. Everything that stood there that was Palestinian has been erased. When I have attempted to visit the towns that friends are originally from in Haifa, all we found were a few bricks of a mosque that once stood there. And now the story is that this is the settlement that made the desert bloom, quote unquote. but they don't tell you that they're stealing Palestinian water resources and then selling it back to us. So this is what sustains it. And again, as Tareq said, the Palestinian Authority, for example, it was co-opted by this apartheid system. And what it serves is to illustrate this as a conflict between two states. No, it's not. And the Gaza Strip is not the Gaza Strip. It is 5 Palestinian governorates under siege for 15 years that are being continuously bombed. Let's frame it like that. Framework matters. And what Palestinians are relying on now is the intelligence of the international community, not concealing information, but showing it all bare, as much as showing exactly what our own leadership is doing. And it is this clinging on to life from all actors. We genuinely don't care if you speak on behalf of Palestinians. And this is, again, where the international community comes in. Where did the Palestinian Authority gain its legitimacy? It continues to be perpetuated within the diplomatic sphere as the sole representative of Palestinians under the PLO. And Palestinians are now saying no. So I'm not sure how many more Nizad Banats we need, how many more Palestinians in arbitrary detention we need to recognize that even the Palestinian Authority should not be tolerated right now.
Thank you, Mariam. And while I don't want to spend too much time on this, I do want quickly Omar and Tareq to weigh in on this as well. So when these reports come out of basically a mass array of atrocities, how do you get people to perceive them from a conceptual framework that isn't colored by the lens of anti-Semitism? In other words, how do you engineer actions vis-a-vis these reports? And then respectively, Tareq as well, how do you get political mobilizations to agitate for change when for the international community and many people, this is the framework from which to perceive everything from? Perhaps Omar can go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that, of course, there is a thing called anti-Semitism. There is hatred of Jewish people that exists around the world. But to conflate that, as Mariam said, with criticism of Israeli policy and actions and the realities on the ground is where the mistake, lies, right? I mean, the reality here is that's part of what the Israeli government and supporters have long been doing, is to divert the conversation, right? So, when momentum builds around, events that are happening, it quickly changes things. It provides the basis for them to say, well, we can't, invite this speaker. We can't have the student group do X, Y, and Z. This is what happens on many campuses because we're concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism, and it's presented in a decontextualized way. And it's part of a larger problem, which is the way this conflict is often thought about in kind of religious terms, that this is some, conflict between two people that spans, back, decades or hundreds of years. And I think Tareq put it very well. I think, people are starting to understand this, for what it is. They're analogs in other parts of the world that have a similar history, which Mariam described, and have a similar reality. It's about structured repression. It's about land, resources, and rights in a system geared to privilege one at the expense, of the other. So that's not to say there aren't religious sentiments among Jews, even among Muslims, that are there, that are real. That's not to say there isn't hatred that's based on who people are that exists. It's not, anti-Semitism is not different than other forms of racism, but to sort of conflate a discussion around rights issues with that feeds into this perception, which is misleading.
Thank you, Omar. Tareq, do you want to weigh in on this?
I mean, just very briefly, because Mariam and Omar said it very eloquently and said everything that I would say. I mean, I would add two brief points. The first is that one way of dealing with this, apart from rejecting this framing to begin with, because it's a very sinister, as Mariam said, framing, is to elevate the voices of the Palestinian rights movement that are also fighting against anti-Semitism. Palestinian rights is about justice and equality and freedom, and it does not, in terms of the movement, does not discriminate in any way. And anti-Semitism, just like its fight against other forms of racism, is a part of the Palestinian movement for rights. So I think understanding that and understanding the values that is animating the Palestinian rights movement is really important. And the second thing is also to understand that this framing that Hamza, you're referring to is not representative also of where the Jewish community is at. I mean, there are major debates within the Jewish community itself about what does and does not constitute anti-Semitism. There is an effort by the Israeli government, currently led by a settler, to obviously weaponize anti-Semitism by pushing forward definitions like the IHRA that very actively position any form of critique of Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism. So describing Israel, for example, as an apartheid state becomes a form of anti-Semitism. But there are other declarations, like the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, that is also led by scholars of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, which are making arguments about why describing Israel as an apartheid state is not anti-Semitic, and that conflating a traditional anti-Semitism, which is hatred of the Jewish people, with any kind of criticism of what is essentially a political project is in itself problematic and something that is not necessarily a uniform view within the Jewish community. So I think just understanding those nuances is really important to push back against this framing.
Great. That's actually very helpful because I think this is the frame that perhaps many people who are watching this discussion might be coming in from. I think there's a second framing that we should quickly get through before we get into the granular detail. And that has to do with the question of Hamas, which is often that if you're having the average protest about Palestinian rights, the first accusation is anti-Semitism. And then the second allegation is to do with Hamas. And this is sort of at two levels. The first is that all protests sort of revolve around claims coming from Hamas. So there's a sort of unitary generalization about what Palestinian protest is. And the second premise is Hamas is bad in all cases. So perhaps you can deal with both premises respectively. And I'd love for Tareq to go first here.
Thank you, Hamza. I mean, I think the best way for me to maybe describe to listeners how the framing matters, and here I agree with Mariam completely that getting the framing is really important. In the international sort of imagination when we're looking at Israel-Palestine, I think the implicit understanding is that the Gaza Strip came under blockade, the stifling blockade that Omar described, when Hamas came into power in the Gaza Strip in 2007. That the blockade was put in response to Hamas because of security reasons, because Hamas was a terrorist organization committed to the destruction of the state of Israel. Through that lens, the blockade is justified. The collective punishment of 2 million Palestinians is unfortunate, but other democracies would do the same if they were faced by that kind of terrorist organization. So to unpack this frame, I'm going to suggest a sort of a correction, which is to say that the Gaza Strip has been under blockade since 1967. Before Hamas even came as an organization and was established as an organization, the Gaza Strip had faced 12 wars by Israeli military against the population since 1948. And since 1967, different forms of blockade have been put in place and experimented on in the Gaza Strip. So the problem is not Hamas, and the problem is not Hamas's ideology and its commitment to armed resistance. The problem fundamentally is the Gaza Strip and the fact that it has 2 million Palestinians, 2/3 of whom want to return to homes that are now in the state of Israel. And if that were to happen, the Jewish majority of the state of Israel would be threatened. And so understanding the frame, understanding the reality on the ground is really important to then understand how Hamas gets used in order to put forward and excuse policies of repression that would otherwise be unacceptable. And that framing is not limited to Hamas. Before Hamas was created, that was the framing through which the PLO was confronted. Any kind of armed resistance against Israel is seen as a form of terrorism, even though armed resistance in anti-colonial movements has always historically been a part of and is legitimated under international law. Certainly what Hamas is doing is not legitimated under international law because it's indiscriminate in its attacks against civilians. But understanding the role of armed struggle is important, and not conflating that with terrorism is also important. Now, if we're looking at the frame of Israel-Palestine and going away from that sort of reality of, or that myth of two sides, and looking at it as a single colonized entity, the biggest perpetrator of violence against civilians is not the Palestinians, and it's certainly not Hamas. It's Israel, including the killing of children, over which the past few weeks has been horrifying, seeing the number of Palestinian children in the West Bank being murdered by Israeli security forces and occupation forces. And so breaking out of the framing of Palestinian resistance equals terrorism is a first step in beginning to understand what Hamas is. Now, once we do that, we see Hamas as an organization that is doing two things. It's committed to an Islamist ideology, and it is an organization that is committed to armed struggle against what it sees and what is a violent settler colonial regime. In both of those instances, Hamas is not necessarily something that does not represent the rest of the Palestinian people. It might represent a significant constituency, significant enough to elect it into power in 2006. And other Palestinians, whether they're secular or anti-Islamist or not, for whatever reason, do not condone armed resistance, is also that is also present in the diversity of the Palestinian people. So Hamas becomes one political color and one ideology of what is a diverse people. The focus on Hamas as a terrorist organization elides its anti-colonial reality and allows Israel to frame things in the same framing which underpinned the Bush administration's war on terror agenda, that this is how we justify essentially for the US imperialism and for Israel colonialism, and this is how we justify the murderous operations of our military. Now, that's not to say that Hamas is not a problematic organization. It is. In many ways, as I just said, it does commit war crimes, and its Islamist ideology is one that, for example, I personally am against. But to get to that level of nuance, we cannot get to that level of nuance by either seeing Hamas only as a terrorist organization or conflating all Palestinians as Hamas. Both of those are nothing but sinister attempts to allow Israel to carry out military operations against Palestinians that are, as Omar has outlined, possibly amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Thank you, Tareq. Omar, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. I mean, people need to keep in mind a historical lens here. I mean, Thought is right. There's no doubt at all that Hamas has committed, war crimes, and also, beyond what Thought mentioned, also arbitrarily arresting and torturing dissidents, opponents, and critics, and the PA is doing the same thing. But let's remember here. Let's have a historical memory here. Israel made a similar argument about Yasser Arafat and his leadership. He passed away, and you had presidential elections, and Mahmoud Abbas came to power largely on a platform of continuing, this idea of a peace process negotiations, and nothing happened there. And then Hamas came to power in sort of a useful foil. Let's, put things in their proper context, right? I mean, the origins of, for example, the hostilities in May, and Thought it put it in very well, was this, and Mariam as well, was the discriminatory efforts to force Palestinians out of their homes in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, right? You can't justify that move. Has nothing to do with Hamas, nor does the mass land grabs, nor does the denial of building permits. Go down the list of serious human rights abuses that are committed every single day for years on end, and you won't find any link to Hamas. But let's even take the example of Gaza, right? Let's even take Gaza, and let's even take Gaza from 2007 when Hamas came to power. The closure of Gaza is a generalized travel ban, right? It's not a policy catered to specific security threats. It's saying nobody can travel into and out of Gaza unless you fit within a humanitarian exemption, right? So a person in Gaza can get a permit, let's say, hypothetically, because they need a life-saving procedure. And by the way, many Palestinians who need urgent medical care are denied permits. But let's say they get one, not to go abroad, by the way, or even to go inside Israel, to go to Ramallah, which the international community recognized as a single territorial entity. So you should be able to move between Ramallah and Gaza the way you move between, I don't know, London and Oxford, to take, since we have a moderator and one of our speakers, in the UK today. Even then, that person could get a permit, but the next week, wants to get a permit to go on vacation, God forbid, or to go for a training, and will be denied that permit. That has nothing to do with Hamas. And let me go a step further. The Israeli government, and in fact, the Netanyahu government during presidential campaigns has made clear that the existence of Hamas leadership inside Gaza is critical to Israeli security interests. This is not some conspiracy theory. Look at statements that Netanyahu and his former Prime Minister Netanyahu and his advisors have said, right? Because it's part of a strategy to further a demographic goal of separating Gaza and the West Bank, which is part of a larger strategy of fragmentation against the Palestinian people. So let's be clear here, right? This is not that complicated. The reality for millions of Palestinians is apartheid and persecution. That doesn't excuse serious abuses that are committed by Palestinian armed groups, that are committed by Palestinian authorities. But to sort of reduce a reality of crimes against humanity to a situation of both sidesisms, or to a situation of, that somehow casts the story is all about, Hamas, that's ahistorical. And that's simply inaccurate, because, the vast majority of abuses on the ground have no link at all. And even where there is some tenuous link, as I said, with the closure of Gaza, the policy is either one that is not security-based or is collective punishment. Is that, okay, maybe a few armed groups did something, so we're going to shut down, fishing for tens of thousands of fishermen, or we're going to not let fuel come to the power plant for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Those are war crimes as well.
Thank you, Omar. Mariam, do you want to weigh in on this before we move on?
Yes, I do. With the question of Hamas, it's a good question, because one of the first accusations that we face is that, well, okay, you're probably Hamas, or do you support Hamas? In 1960, the UN General Assembly actually noted, suggested, quote unquote, in how we use that language, or the deeply concerned, that Israel should release all Palestinian detainees, and that it should cease the deportation or driving out of Palestinians. Since 1960, we've seen 1967, where Israel only took over more lands. We've seen 1987 until 1993, 94, where Israel continued to repress Palestinian right to self-determination. Palestinians, as a people under an occupation, military-imposed occupation, have the right to defend themselves, have the right to challenge and confront and struggle any occupying power or foreign domination by all means possible, including armed resistance. Not that we need international organizations to tell us that, because we're the ones being killed, but we have that enshrined, because across history, no colonized people got their independence by sitting down on a table and trying to convince their abuser that they are being ethnically cleansed, that this is an apartheid state, that this is an apartheid regime. So in terms of Hamas and its confrontation of Israel, it has the right for armed resistance. And maybe it's time for us to unpack our own reservations on that, and what we fear on that. The human rights violations that Hamas commits, for me, is what it has done to Palestinians, from arbitrary detention to torture to ill treatment there. But in confronting the Israeli colonial ethnic cleansing, that is a right enshrined under international law. And if anyone across the globe experiences these kinds of pains on the daily, they resist back in whatever means possible that are available to them. So this is something we need to also distinguish and recognize and unpack our own dissonance with it, because it is being weaponized to delegitimize Palestinian struggle and resistance. So in that end, that's what I wanted to know and emphasize.
Thank you, Mariam. I will just remind my friends who are tuning in to put their questions in the chat, just so we can get to them in roundabouts 20 minutes. Having said that, the third facet of the discussion I want to focus on is, again, May using the thought experiment of how people respond to such a discussion. So there's a claim from anti-Semitism, there's a claim from Hamas. The third claim is the claim from this can never be solved. There is no solution because no one knows what the correct solution is, right? This comes up a lot, both internationally and perhaps locally. And I think what I would want to do is perhaps make the discussion local and then make it global. And perhaps starting with Tareq, because what you've made very clear, very helpfully, is sort of how the average Palestinian is stuck between an organization which has tendencies that they might not agree with, but broadly facilitate armed resistance that might be necessary, but also an organization which has in many ways debilitated long-term prospects for progress in the region. So between these two then, what does locally the path forward for Palestinians look like?
I mean, you're seeing it. What you're seeing today in Palestine is mass mobilization. It's resistance every day and in different ways and in different contexts. This is what the path forward is. I mean, there's this sense that a process of decolonization has to come with a blueprint, and that we are going to have to follow certain steps as Palestinians in order to achieve our rights and in order to get into some kind of negotiated settlement. That's not how it works. That's not how it's going to work. The way apartheid ended in South Africa might not be the way apartheid ends in Palestine. We're living in a different world. We're living in a different region. Our region at the moment, 30 years ago might have, in terms of the regimes and the powers of the region, been in support of the Palestinian people. And today the regimes of the region are openly normalizing with Israel against, obviously, the desires of their own people. But the region has fundamentally shifted. The moment we're living in today is unknown, and it's unclear how it will unfold. And I think that the Palestinians are figuring this out as they go. At the moment, there is no Palestinian leadership that is strategically thinking, that is putting forward a strategy that has legal and military and economic policies that can guide the Palestinian people. There isn't that kind of representation at the moment. But the resistance is happening, it's ongoing, and it's what we see today on the ground. Now, I think our biggest challenge as Palestinians is to begin thinking about the political power that this mobilization can develop, to start answering these bigger questions about what decolonization means, and how to begin shifting the balance of power between Palestinians and Israel. But in terms of trying to position it as a sort of a blueprint, or to try to be a bit more articulate about what it is, I think the tactics will have to evolve as we go. Having said that, there is one thing that is clear, and that should guide the different forms of tactics. It should guide how we think about these bigger questions. And that thing that's clear is what we're all going towards. Now, there is confusion. Let's say if we're taking the Palestinian leadership in the PA now, and I say leadership in quotation because they're not actually the leaders of the Palestinian movement, they're the people who are sitting in the Palestinian Authority. For them, there's confusion about what their struggle is. They think their struggle is state building. They think their struggle is about building the institutions of the state of Palestine. That's not what the Palestinian struggle is about. The Palestinian struggle is an anti-colonial struggle. It's the struggle against Zionism at the moment, and for the full liberation of the Palestinian people. And by the way, when we think about the Palestinian people, it's also pre-Zionism, so British colonialism, and it's also looking at the region as well, and the sort of the struggles that other people in the region are facing in their own authoritarian regime. So contextualizing Palestine in this reality, and thinking about a political struggle that's focused on decolonization, that's the vision. That's where Palestinian people need to be going. The tactics, as Mariam talked about, including military tactics, legal tactics, economic tactics, are still to be figured out. I think they are being figured out. And I think that I see it as us coming out of a detour of 30 years through the Oslo process, and beginning now to put ourselves back on a corrective path. What that path looks like and where it takes us, I think we're all trying to figure out.
Thank you, Tareq. Omar, do you want to come in on this? question.
Yeah, let me take it in a little bit of a different direction, which is to say that this idea that the realization of basic rights for Palestinians should await a political solution is entirely the wrong framing. I mean, every single day, a Palestinian is born in Gaza without the right to move freely. You know, every single day, a Palestinian is born in the West Bank without civil rights. You know, every single day a Palestinian is born inside Israel proper, by definition with an inferior legal status to people of a different, background. Every day a Palestinian refugee is born outside without the right to return to the country that they and their families from, solely because they're Palestinian. This idea that severe human rights abuses should only be solved in political solutions, that's a fallacy. That's not how we treat crimes against humanity in other parts of the world. We don't, tell the Uyghurs of China or the Rohingya of Myanmar, I'm really sorry, but there's not the right political circumstances right now for a solution. So you just have to kind of wait for it, right? I mean, that goes back to the problematic, framing. Look, everybody wants a political solution, right? But that the lack of a political solution can't be the justification for continued apartheid, or persecution. And by the way, this is not just me speaking, right? A crime against humanity, the world defined an entire international legal order, which says, I mean, what's the term mean? Crimes against all of us. The world says when you have them, anybody who commits them should be investigated and prosecuted, not only in certain international courts, not only in the home country, but in every court anywhere in the world, right? And not just that, all people, all entities need to evaluate all forms of complicity, with those crimes. And let me take it a step further, right? If you believe, as many people do, in peace or in a solution, your first step has to be to recognize the reality on the ground for what it is, and to take steps to end that reality. If you believe in peace, you need to, there's no peace, there is no, let me put it another way, there is no solution to this situation that involves caging 2 million Palestinians in an open air prison in the Gaza Strip. There is no solution that involves the maintenance of the structures of apartheid. There is no solution that does not involve the basic rights to Palestinian refugees that are enshrined under international law. So if you want to get a solution, let's start chipping away at these building blocks, which anyways under international law need to be addressed. So I think that the idea that has it all wrong. And by the way, and sorry to keep adding, but whenever people talk about solutions, especially as debaters, you probably want to think twice to say, why are we talking so much about a solution and not the problem that necessitates a solution, right? There's been so much talk about a two-state solution, you almost forget what the problem is that necessitates a solution, right? And that problem, the core of it, right, is apartheid and persecution, all the abuses that we're talking about. So let's deal with the reality, let's deal with the problem. And if we start, making progress, and by the way, any solution to anything requires an end to these things. So let's end them, and then let's talk about solutions.
Before Mariam jumps in on this, I think the point that you need to stop widespread human rights abuses and perhaps the killing of children as a first step towards anything, and perhaps the discussion on solutions shouldn't obfuscate that reality is fair. I think perhaps the more reasonable question at play here isn't necessarily what's the first step. It's something that I want Mariam to weigh in on, which is that one of the ways that settler colonialism manifests itself is that it makes any dismantling of colonialism only possible through the involvement of the settler, right? Like the structure is designed in such a way. And in this situation, the settler is Israel. So necessarily some discussion needs to be had about what that role of Israel looks like, keeping in mind the structural dependencies that the people of Palestine have on that state. So perhaps we can have Mariam weigh in on this, and if anyone wants to come back on that.
Thank you, Hamza. That's actually a very good point, that we consistently continue to point out, okay, well, what's Israel's role in this? I've never seen anyone put, again, abused or abused on a table and say, we'll figure it out. I've seen accountability, but I've also seen denial of abuses happening against, whether it's women, whether it's the LGBTQ community, whether it's the Black community in the US, whether it was French colonial rule in Tunisia and Algeria. You don't involve the perpetrator in seeking justice. So it's not a solution. This isn't a nuisance or a problem or a conflict, again, between two equal sides. It is a colonial oppression. It is supremacy. It is domination. It is the theft of resources with effort to incapacitate any Palestinian possibility or opportunity to grow, to build a sustainable society. And for me, dismantling colonialism is starting the trials. Let every war criminal be held accountable. I personally want every soldier that laid hands on me held accountable. And that is my right. And it is my right to travel across Palestine without being held up on a checkpoint, while an Israeli settler can gradually take more and more resources, but also impunity, just very easily pass through the checkpoint through Israel's internal discriminatory policies and racial profiling. And I think, as Tareq said, we're figuring it out slowly. But why are we still trying to figure it out? It's because we are being obstructed every single time we try to make any movements forward. So we continuously have to adapt and we continuously have to change. And the only step forward for Palestinians is also a step forward for the world. Is it not time to take your own dissonance and sit with it and say, well, why am I supporting apartheid? Well, why do I believe in this narrative? And to unpack that. So I really think the first step forward is stop funding. Stop funding this colonialism. It is, most of the aid is going to military assistance. And if it's for the Palestinians, it's going to the security forces that are politically assassinating us and beating us in the streets. So stop funding this colonialism in all of its faces. And then start demanding Palestinian rights and refuse complicity in it. If your own state is saying it's criminal to boycott, it is your right to not be complicit in this colonial apartheid and persecution. It is your right as well. So it is a change also, I think, on a global level. And that is the first step forward. It is, what are we reimagining from here on now?
I think it's a noble ethical goal to have, to never engage with the oppressor. I don't know if that lines up in terms of practical and strategic considerations, which is sort of the point I was trying to push there. And perhaps I can get Tareq to weigh in on this again, because one of the questions that many people have is why the anti-settler movement within Israel has not taken up, right? Like, why is it the case that you don't have people within Israel saying, or a significant enough number of people within Israel saying, this is incorrect, this is inhumane, we should do something about this? And this is, again, perhaps where the example of South Africa is demonstrative, where against the devolved government, you had people who were part of the white community protesting in the early 90s. So it wasn't just a movement where you have exclusively ANC protesters. There was some engagement there. And perhaps Tareq can weigh in on this.
I mean, I think there's several things to say. I think fundamentally, when we think about why, I think your question is, why are Israelis, the average Israeli citizen, continuing to support the apartheid regime? I think we need to understand that it's not only Israelis, it's also a very Zionist constituency in the US in terms of the Christian evangelicals and in terms of the Jewish community, the Zionist Jewish community there. It's also the US itself as a superpower for very clear geopolitical reasons interested in supporting this. So there's a very clear sort of system that is allowing this to remain in place. Now, in terms of the average Israeli citizen, I don't think the average Israeli citizen cares about the occupation, knows about the occupation, thinks about the occupation. For them, even the Palestinians living inside Israel are Arab, are neighbors that come to garden or build their streets, or that they encounter in pharmacies or in healthcare institutions. So the reality is that there is mass denial. And the question that I always think about is why? Why is there this mass denial? And that's because they can. There is no reason for Israeli Jews today to think about the occupation because fundamentally their lives are not impacted or shaped by it. Their lives through visa-free access to the EU, through travel to the US, through the occasional condemnation from the UN, but otherwise nothing else, through Ben & Jerry's no longer selling ice cream to settlements, but otherwise being available in every supermarket in Israel, the cost of the occupation has been minimal. So really, the reason that they should mobilize against apartheid is non-existent. I mean, and that's not to say that there isn't opposition within Israel. There is, and there is. The left wing has been decimated over the years, but there is a left wing constituency. There is an anti-Zionist constituency. They are allies. B'Tselem coming out with their report is a step in the right direction. So there are efforts and there are cracks that are showing, but they are nowhere near where we need to be because of the strength of the ideology that is in place in Israel and because of the culture of impunity that Mariam so eloquently spoke about, which allows Israel to maintain a facade of democracy and to maintain a separateness with the military regime. So the occupation is different and separate, and at worst, a necessity because of security. None of these things are actually confronted because there's no need to confront them. The average Israeli life hasn't been impacted by this. The other thing that I want to say, and very briefly on this, is beginning to think about the sort of the broader structures that are in place for Palestinians. Now, for Palestinians to begin, you started, Hamza, talking about, the settlers. How do the settlers become a part of this? The prerequisite for Palestinians to begin talking about what happens with the settlers, so Israeli Jews on their land, is for Israeli Jews to recognize what they've done. The perpetrator needs to understand that they've become a perpetrator. That's the starting point for the conversation, not the end point of the conversation. Dismantling apartheid then leads to a negotiated settlement and reconciliation. It's not a prerequisite for it. It's not a byproduct of it. It's a prerequisite for it. And so there is a conversation to be had about, the settlements and about the settlers and about land distribution and about redistributing the resources. All of the conversations that are happening in South Africa today, after the dismantling of political apartheid, needs to inform also our process of decolonization. But that can't happen when there's this mass denial about where we're at and what the perpetrator has been doing.
Thank you, Tareq. Omar, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I would weigh in by sort of, saying that for most, Israelis, right, they sort of are able to sort of have their cake and eat it too, right? When it comes to apartheid, for example, their first argument is, well, Palestinians vote in Israeli elections and or one of their first arguments. But then when Ben & Jerry's says, we want to, not sell our ice cream in the West Bank, suddenly, settlements are part of Israel and incorporated and everything else. I mean, there's just, again, speaking to debaters, there's an inconsistency, in the argument, right? You can't sort of have, both positions. And I think it is important to highlight that there are, there is a good group of groups like B'Tselem and activists within Israeli society that are coming to terms and grappling, with these concepts. And they will be the first to tell you nothing will change absent international pressure. I think Mariam put it really well. I mean, people don't give up structures of privilege, without there being, a push. And that's what's needed at this point, right? Take the example of Gaza. We've seen the same cycles of vicious, attacks and bloodshed in 2021, 2019, 2018, 2014, 2012, 2008. I mean, you have kids in Gaza that, it's not an exaggeration that it can count, like they count their years of life by years of hostilities that they've been through. How do you break that cycle, right? How do you force Israel to make a choice, among, on its policies? And that's what we have been pushing when we say ending complicity in these crimes. What does that mean? That means countries looking at bilateral agreements to ensure that they're not just with settlements, right, but looking at agreements with Israel proper and seeing ways in which they may be entrenching the crimes. Businesses doing the very same thing. I think Ben & Jerry's decision should be a model for other companies. I mean, this is a company that's based on principle that made the choice, to stop, to not renew its contract with its Israeli distributor over the fact that they would not stop their contribution through sales into settlements. I think there's a need to support accountability, investigations, prosecutions. So there really is a lot of work to be done. And I think that's you'll hear that first and foremost from Israelis that are fighting to end these injustices as well.
That makes sense. Thank you, Omar. I asked because the vast majority of questions that we're getting from our friends watching are on some level about the involvement of the United States, the international community more generally, and then why that involvement has not been as effective as it could have been. And perhaps we can start off with Mariam here, because I think Tareq makes the fair point that it's interesting where often a lobby of those pertaining to represent Israeli interests in the US tend to have even more extreme objectives and extreme agendas than many people even living within Israel. So for instance, AIPAC comes to mind, the condemnation that Congresswoman Omar faced after her criticism of AIPAC comes to mind. So perhaps we can look at this then in the context of the United States, a fresh president in office. Does the role of the United States matter significantly? Should it matter significantly? If it does, what should it be? So perhaps Mariam can come in there.
Thank you, Hamza. I do want to add on the question of allies within Israel. Israel is not a democracy. It imprisons 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds that refuse to serve in the army. So we also need to keep that in mind, that it's like the effort to even want to be exposed to what is happening to Palestinians is criminalized within the Israeli system itself. So let's also start speaking about that, because Israel sold itself as the only democracy in the Middle East. It represses its own very nation that it claims it's trying to save, right? But more than this is, okay, so let's speak about the US role. I personally think that the analogy between Palestine and South Africa is not as accurate as Palestine and the US. The US is a colonial state. Let us recognize that. It is a settler colonial state that has committed massacres, continues to commit massacres, and still has zero accountability, was given veto power in the United Nations, and continues to quote unquote police the world. So we need to recognize its own supremacy that persists until today. We see American white supremacy. We've seen it very visible in the Trump administration. And I only think it's going to continue to fester and grow unless it's really tackled at its root. The US continues to give Israel impunity. And any presidential administration that has claimed to want to seek a, quote, again, solution instead of justice has persistently provided Israel with military aid. And that is basically giving the settler militia more resources to keep building their tools and their weapons and their arms, which they sell at global conferences for weapons. This is the role of the US. It is the provision of impunity. It is acting as the vanguard of Israeli colonialism within the international sphere. More than this is at the basic level, US official documents don't even admit that there are Palestinians. Palestinians with Israeli citizenship continue to be referred to as Israeli Arabs. Is that not also part and parcel of why the colonialism persists, of why congresswomen like Ilhan Omar are attacked when they speak out against this injustice? And then again, that's also tied with America's own racial hierarchy. You need, if this was, a white American Christian man, it might have been taken even more easily. America's own ethno-religious supremacy needs to be taken into account. It's not just about Palestinians, it's about the US. And this is, I think, what Palestinians have been trying to highlight, the inability of the international community to actually stand with justice and to stop supporting Israeli colonialism is very much entwined with the inability to hold themselves accountable.
Thank you, Mariam. Tareq, do you want to come in on this question of America?
No, to be honest, I think Mariam brought it home. I think it's understanding it as a settler colonial state, understanding white supremacy in Israel and in the US, and understanding its military agenda and imperial agenda in the region. I mean, I think those are the constellation of factors that make it what it is today. And just the one point I would say is that Israel would struggle very much to exist as the state it is today without American military, diplomatic, and economic support. And I think that's important for people who are committed to justice here to note and confront.
Thank you. Omar?
Yeah, I don't think I can add to what Mariam said.
Great, thank you. Another sort of like broad theme of questions that we're getting. It's interesting because on one level, it's about how to understand the Gaza Strip, how Palestine is received abroad. But I think on a secondary level, a lot of the questions are assuming a knowledge base that you might have a broader version of. In other words, what I'm trying to get at here is how do people have educated conversations about Palestine if they want to have educated conversations about Palestine? How do they educate themselves about Palestine? What should we look out for? Who do we trust in terms of the information that's coming in then? Because I find the questions really interesting because these questions are almost downstream of the discussion that we're having, where a lot of our questions are a bit upstream. So then this, like broadly speaking, if I want to find out more about Palestine, how do you think we should perceive that? And then when we're reading, what's the framework that we use to evaluate that information then? And perhaps Omar can come in there, considering that there's a report that has been published.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first and foremost is, I mean, people should listen to people who live under that system, that live under apartheid. And, you know, like Mariam and Tareq said this, right? I mean, Palestinians have been saying this for years and decades. And unfortunately, the world didn't listen to their voices. So I think it's incumbent upon, you know, folks to listen to, you know, those voices, right? You don't need, you know, that should be sufficient. There's a huge body of work. In addition, I think human rights groups on the ground are doing incredibly valuable work, right? Israeli and Palestinian groups. And I think increasingly there is consensus among the human rights community about what the reality on the ground is. I mean, again, it's not just Palestinian groups or international groups. There was an event at the Israeli Knesset, right? The parliamentary body where, you know, I think 6 or 7 Israeli groups participate in an event entitled, with apartheid in the title, referring to Israel's conduct, hosted by a Knesset member who's in the government and one that's in the opposition, right? So I think it's important to understand that consensus, to look at the reporting of human rights groups. I think there are, you know, important, you know, news sources that are providing, you know, information, you know, on the ground that can be read in English, you know, from a variety of areas. And I don't think there's a lack of information. I think you find, I mean, even from the ground, you can listen to the families in Sheikh Jarrah on Twitter. You can see commentaries from people in Gaza. I mean, you just have to sort of look for it and not rely on, you know, some of the ways that we get news information, because I don't think that speaks as well to the reality on the ground as the kind of firsthand accounts you'll get from communities living there, from human rights groups and others.
I think those are very fair suggestions. Tareq, do you want to weigh in on this at all?
No, I mean, I think that relying on I say no, and then I go into my answer. So yes, I just want to add one point, which is the centering of the Palestinian voices and organizations is the primary thing here. But what I want the listeners here to think about is that portraying what's happening in Palestine as complex is also in its own right an effort to try to disincentivize support. This isn't complex. It's a very straightforward issue, and it's an issue that isn't exceptional to Palestine. It's in Australia and in South Africa and in Canada and in the US, and indigenous people have faced it for years and decades and centuries. So this isn't complex. It's pretty straightforward, and hearing Palestinians, using their resources, listening to Palestinian scholars and activists and thinkers and writers is the way that we can get an unvarnished story about what's happening.
Thank you, Tareq. Mariam?
I do just want to add one point. In addition to what's been said, the emphasis on, look at the Palestinian testimonies, especially since we are facing censorship across many levels and, assassinations from the Israeli settler military and from Palestinian authorities. But the evidence is there. I would suggest that maybe you don't even have to look at what's happening today. Maybe it's time to go back and see how the narrative has been twisted about 1948, about the 50s, about the 60s, because it's the same thing. A lot of the stories and experiences I share with my parents and my grandparents today resonate with them so well because they've been experiencing it for decades. So I would suggest going back as well and honoring that history of the massacres that were committed and saying, well, this time we're not going to let decades pass so that it can be thrown into the archive of history. We're going to actually hold them accountable.
Fair enough. Thank you. What I do want to do is quickly, again, we cycle back because we're sort of regimentally constrained by the questions we're getting. And again, a lot of the questions are throwing out what we think of perhaps as buzzwords like, what about the Oslo Accords, or what is two-state, what is one state, all of that stuff. And I think maybe perhaps the best way to approach this in the shortest time possible is to give a quick overview of why this conversation works with certain assumptions behind it. So perhaps discussing the assumptions behind that sort of discussion, as opposed to looking at why each one systematically does not work, would be helpful. And then the second thing, I think more broadly, is the question of how do you legally hold Israel accountable, right? So if you have international law mechanisms in place, why do they constrain themselves to condemnations which themselves don't go far enough, but don't come in the form of actual sanctions? What's stopping their people there, perhaps, is sort of the broader question there. And perhaps we can start with Omar there.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the second one and leave Oslo for Tara and Mariam. But I mean, in terms of legally, look, Israel, Palestine is not the only place in the world where, unfortunately, international law and standards aren't always followed and where there is impunity. Before I covered Israel Palestine for Human Rights Watch, I covered Egypt, and I wrote a report about the Rab'a massacre, right? One day in which more than 800 Egyptians were gunned down and killed protesting a military coup that took place there. And the person who orchestrated that is now the president of Egypt. You can look at many other contexts, unfortunately, around the region, and there is impunity for serious human rights abuses. That doesn't mean international law doesn't matter. It's the set of rules and our normative standard for evaluating situations around the world. So, and there is some movement in the positive direction. So the most clear one is the International Criminal Court, which has this year, earlier in 2021, said that it had jurisdiction over serious crimes committed in Palestine. In addition, the outgoing prosecutor, the former prosecutor, opened a formal probe into serious crimes committed in Palestine. And in May, the International Criminal Court said it was monitoring, for example, the hostilities that were taking place. That's quite important, that investigation. That could lead down the road eventually to indictments and eventually prosecutions and maybe even convictions. It's a long, steep road ahead. In addition, there are other mechanisms. For example, the United Nations in May established a commission of inquiry to look into not only the events that broke out in the spring, but also their larger context, including systematic discrimination or oppression of Palestinians. That's a standing commission of inquiry and has a mandate to look across the river and the sea. So I think that's quite important to understand that mechanism now exists. There are, of course, efforts that are being taken by states or companies with regards to settlements and business activities. There in the past have been prosecutions and cases brought against individual Israelis involved in criminal activity. So there is some things festering, but again, When it comes to international law, of course, political considerations, powerful states can thwart these attempts for justice. But there is some movement, and they require or call on the support of the international community.
Thank you. And perhaps like Tareq first, before you get into answering the first question, I think because we have so many questions and because it's such a unique opportunity, I would editorialize here and just say I wouldn't answer something that can be looked up very easily on a Wikipedia page. That's just what I would say when you answer that question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be brief in talking about the Oslo Accords, but just to take your advice, Hamza, and say what is the assumption that's underpinning this panel. And I think the assumption here is that we're no longer looking at a reality where a kind of bilateral peace process that sees state building for Palestinians as the primary goal, that has failed, and that many would argue was wrong to begin with, and that is the assumption underpinning this panel, that approaching this through bilateral negotiations, which produced the Oslo Accords, which were committed theoretically to the idea of building a state of Palestine in the occupied territories and dismantling the occupation, that assumption that's based in partitioning that land into Israel and Palestine, that has failed, and that is not necessarily the just way to achieve full rights for the Palestinian people. So I think it's very clear that Mariam, Omar, and myself are moving in that assumption, and that's how we should understand the Oslo Accords. So this is when we're talking about the Oslo Accords, that's what we're talking about.
I think that's absolutely critical because, like you said, this assumption comes with the state-based argument. Before Mariam comes in, I do want to push back on this because when a lot of listeners listen to you don't want a two-state solution, you don't want a two-state solution, they start thinking, what do you want exactly? Does that make sense? And in that tone of voice that I am currently using. So then the question becomes, what is the alternative, right? Because then this is taken in extreme directions, which is, oh, where will all the Israeli Jews go, that sort of thing. So often the negative thesis against two-state solutions is presupposed to be something that's extreme. So perhaps that's definitely not what you're hinting at, but I just want to make clear what your implication there is in terms of responding to the two-state thesis.
Well, let me just sort of say that the two-state solution hasn't been about building two states. It's been about maintaining Israeli apartheid. So when we think about, what the end of the two-state solution is, that's how we need to understand it. It hasn't practically and effectively been about two states. It's been about maintaining apartheid and maintaining the status quo. So that's the first thing to say. The second, though, is that as we've talked about in the past few minutes, and as Mariam and Omar said, the point isn't to say one state or two states or 18 states. The point is to address the war crimes that are happening on the ground. It might be a two-state in the end. If that two-state is one that provides full rights for Palestinians, including the right of return, including full equality, including freedom from occupation, and if that's what the Palestinians, through fair representation, decide they want, great, that's wonderful. I'm not going to stand against that. But that's besides the point. Thinking one state, two state is a red herring. That's not the point of the discussion. And when we say we don't want two states or that the Oslo Accords has failed, it's not to say that we don't want a political resolution. Again, it's to say that before we get to the point where we can talk about what a political resolution looks like, we need to address the crimes of the past and the ongoing crimes of the present. And then we'll go from there.
And I think teasing that out is absolutely critical because I can see these conversations happening after this discussion. So it's perhaps important to get those implications out. Mariam, do you want to weigh in on this question then about sort of the assumptions behind the discussion that we have about one state?
I do. So one of the concerns about Palestinians, saying there is no one state, two state solution, it's basically just a roundtable of getting us to continue speaking. The same thing with the bureaucratic measures that continue to hinder the ICC prosecutor from holding war criminals accountable. Is this fear of, oh, well, what does that mean for Israeli settlers? Okay, yeah, it means they're out of Palestine. Why is that bad? Why is it bad that we want our war criminals outside of the jurisdiction where they can continue to keep burning us alive, like they did in Douma Nablus, or killing Palestinians, where 20% of those that were killed in 2019 were children, carpet bombing Gaza, trying to dispossess Sheikh Jarrah with the arrogance of a settler named Yaakov saying, if I don't steal your home, someone else will, or settlers in Haifa marking Palestinian homes with death to Arabs, I don't see why that's a bad thing. And if that's a bad thing, then there needs to be unpacking there. Because for us, it means our right to live. And it means the right of people to live justly and freely. And the right to say this is Palestine, again, without being held in military detention. So this fear of what it means for Palestinians to say things like from the river to the sea, for Palestinians to say, yes, I do not believe in the legitimacy of a colonial state that is criminal by essence, but legitimized under international frameworks. I personally don't see that as a bad thing. As someone who continues to experience the system of apartheid and discrimination, I don't see that as a bad thing. As Palestinians in Gaza that don't have electricity or water, and the Palestinian Authority under Oslo held sanctions on Gaza in 2018, and then beat up protesters in Ramallah and in the West Bank when they said, lift the sanctions. I don't see that as a bad thing. And this is something that really needs to be addressed in that regards, because it is costing us a lot.
Thank you. And I think it's a bit absurd to imagine that even being able to watch this discussion on a computer is a privilege for many people in the region. We've gotten a lot of questions about how the Palestinian youth can involve itself within different forms of resistance then. And this is where I want to frame the question slightly differently and more broadly. So I don't think it's just the case that you have the PA and Hamas, and then you have a third option broadly called resistance. It's that they actively interact with each other, right? So for instance, I think the Palestinian Authority just yesterday deleted the freedom of expression sort of protection for civil servants in its code of conduct. I don't know if any of you saw this. And then there are obvious reasons, just like Omar said, it is in Israel's interest to have Hamas around. I'm sure that on some level, Hamas derives its legitimacy from the urgency that some Palestinians face when those airstrikes come. So when you have these actors, the PA and Hamas respectively, interacting with each other, how do you facilitate perhaps youth-based progressive resistance, considering that both of these actors have incentives to restrict what sort of protest that is to begin with? And perhaps I can get that.
I think actually maybe you should start with Mariam, since she's on the ground and doing a lot of the activist work. So Mariam, maybe we should start with you.
Mariam, please.
Thank you, Tareq. But I do want to make a disclaimer that I kind of disagree in that regards, because Palestinian diaspora has every right to say everything as Palestinians on the ground. And this is something that's important, that almost half, maybe more than half of Palestinians are in exile, that they don't get to choose whether to return or not. And our voices in diaspora and in exile are as important as those here. And this is a point that I would like to emphasize, because the right of return, the refugees, this is the cause. So let's also listen to that. In terms of youth and how we can help youth movements, what youth are you referring to? Youth that speak English like me, or youth in Beta that throw stones, that burn tires, that sit and chant Allahu Akbar at night to disturb settler colonial comfort. So it's also a reflection of what youth you mean. I think Palestinians across all ages right now are really fighting for their lives. I personally don't feel safe, not from the Palestinian Authority, not from Israeli colonial settlers. I don't feel safe. So how can you protect youth? Is by saying, yeah, we want to protect Palestine, not just supporting movements, because this is where you falter into which movement, and this is where you falter into factional loyalism and authority loyalism, like we saw happen with the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. The number one thing is don't be complicit. Refuse complicity. You will receive backlash. And it is important to continue creating communities with one another abroad, for those that will risk employment, for those that will risk slander and social isolation, for sticking up for being anti-apartheid, essentially, and anti-colonial Israel. And I think this is a time where we continue hiring the ceiling. I've said this in March, and I'll say this again. And I've said this a decade ago. It really feels like we're at a final breath. It feels like the world is at a point where it can choose to catch up with the changes that are necessarily happening or not. The difference is how much lives and how many injustices we're going to suffer through it. But I genuinely do believe that change is going to come. Which direction it goes to is really up to us. And it's more basic. It's so much more basic than we can ever make it seem. So there, looking at where to empower. Stop buying Israeli products. Sabra hummus, it comes from settlements. Learn to make your own hummus if you don't want to buy Palestinian hummus. But it really is a lot simpler than we try and make it seem. But lives are on the line.
I respect the claim that we might be at an inflection point now, that resistance is indeed necessary, even though it comes with high costs. I guess the more specific frame I would want perhaps Tareq and Omar to weigh in, then keeping in mind what you just said, is how does that interact with other actors then having their own interests in terms of having a monopoly on how to deal with Israel and how to deal with colonialism? Tareq, perhaps you can come in on this, keeping in mind my earlier framing as well.
Do you mean other actors, including the PA or Hamas or other actors? I mean, I think these actors, as we said at the beginning of the call, are each driven by their own interests. The PA's interest is very clear. They want to maintain power. And they want to maintain power not to achieve state building, because I think it's very clear that this isn't the direction they're going. They want to maintain power through autonomy and to maintain their authoritarian hold on sort of the political space in the West Bank. Hamas has a different agenda. Hamas's agenda is liberation through armed struggle in order to create expand its Islamist ideology. That, when I say that, I'm already aware that for many of our listeners, that appears frightening, and that appears to be something that is not necessarily sort of seen through the lens of certainly the Western lens that we talked about, that can be seen as very problematic. That ideology is, as I said, part and parcel of the Palestinian political system, Palestinian social and civil reality, and it has its goal of achieving decolonization in order to achieve ground for its Islamist ideology. Now, those are two actors that are strategic and pragmatic and committed to these values. Now, the rest of the Palestinian movement has a whole continuum of ideologies and politics and goals, and ultimately the liberation struggle has to bring everyone together. If the goal is clear, which is decolonization, it can't be achieved by one faction or one individual or one constituency. It has to be a national goal. And this is how we learn also from other anti-colonial movements. If we think specifically about the ANC explicitly defined itself as a national movement for all people and all races in South Africa that are committed to the values of decolonization. And so when we're looking at the PA, structurally now, the PA is part of the problem. Hamas, in many ways, is part of the problem. Both of these issues need to be addressed. But in terms of Hamas and Fatah as factions, as well as all the other factions, as well as the non-factions, the youth, civil society, all of these actors need to mobilize together in a single national struggle for decolonization.
Thank you, Tareq. And before, Omar, you've been on this. I respect the intention that perhaps the necessity of what's happening on the ground right now means that the broader goal, which is decolonization, a stoppage of these mass atrocities, needs to be the prerogative. I guess my question is, often protest can be constrained specifically by these actors when dealing with the problem. So again, I'll mention the example of the PA here from just yesterday in terms of taking out freedom of expression protections for its employees from its civil service code of conduct. One also imagines that if, for instance, members of the LGBT community or if a gay Palestinian kid comes out to protest, I imagine Hamas would have some issues with that. So just keeping that in mind again, how do we, if the end goal is to bring the movement forward towards one goal, do that when there are significant differences amongst the different factions of the movement as to how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the movement or in the way that Tareq or Mariam can, but what I can say is there is, I think, the emergence of of a movement that connects these issues, right? So, for example, and Mariam can speak to this better than I can, but there have been protests, for example, that have taken place led by feminist Palestinian groups across the West Bank and across Israel about a variety of gender and sexuality issues that are at the intersection of occupation, apartheid, and advancing much more generally, an agenda for women's liberation, women's rights. So I think there are groups and activists that are sort of doing that, on the ground in different areas. So I don't think we should necessarily see these as, at odds. Like any society, Palestine faces these challenges. It's not unique. It has human rights issues that are not, 100% linked to the reality on the ground or to apartheid, right? There are people that are making those connections, and that doesn't excuse or justify any of that. And I think Palestinians themselves are among the first, to be the most vocal about these issues. I mean, Palestinians have been on the streets in recent weeks, not about, Israel or apartheid, but about the PA and its role in everything. In Gaza, Palestinians have taken to the streets against Hamas authorities. A major, Palestinian NGO in Gaza recently published, about, in fact, the actions of storing weapons that Hamas has done in populated areas. Maybe I'll stop there because I think we might lose Mariam in a minute. So.
Thank you, Omar. And I just did want to end with perhaps Mariam coming in with any final thoughts that she has before she zooms off, and then I can get perhaps Tareq and Omar to do something similar. But let's start with Mariam quite immediately. If she can, of course.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, can you just come in with any final thoughts then before you jump off?
Okay, first off, sorry, I do have to jump off, but thank you so much for this. My final thoughts on this is take it beyond Palestine. That everything that is being done here, everything that we are saying about Palestine is also setting precedents for future struggles, precedents for current struggles. And we have faith, not just because we have faith in ourselves, but because this has been done before. Empires have fallen, colonial regimes have fallen, and it is scary and it is terrifying. And we keep asking, what's the alternative? And as Thought again noted, some of us don't really know. We know what we need, we know what we want, and we're going to keep going with it. That just because sometimes we won't have answers for what the alternative might be or look like, doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And it is really, really important that we keep going despite the pressures that are going to come towards us. Again, it is setting precedents at a global scale. So for this, thank you all, and thank you in advance to whoever ends up, showing up to remember that there is community, no matter how isolated we feel. I know as Palestinians, we felt isolated for decades, and somehow we're just seeing a lot of new solidarity come up with all of this. So those are my final thoughts. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mariam, for those inspirational words. And indeed, for someone like myself, the Palestinian struggle is inspirational with respect to perhaps Pashtun people within Pakistan or the Ahmadi minority. So there's lots of people fighting that struggle, and they indeed take lots of inspiration and stock from the Palestinian resistance. Tareq and Omar, I would also respect your final thoughts here. And the attempt in this conversation has to be to clear up as many misconceptions, misconceived notions, misplaced assumptions that people have in even discussing Palestine or even perceiving Palestine. And I hope that we've done a reasonably good job of that. Having said that, if you have any final thoughts in that respect or otherwise, those would be very appreciated. Tareq, perhaps we can start with you.
Just to thank you, Hamza, for providing this kind of platform and for centering Palestinian voices and the voices of our allies, because I think that this is something that's so rare, unfortunately, and being able to do that So thank you for everyone also behind the scenes who's made this possible. I just want to echo Mariam's points and just end on one note to say that the urgency that we have as Palestinians isn't because, just because we're tired of occupation and apartheid. That's the reality. But also the urgency is because if this isn't confronted, the reality of another Nakba, the reality of another transfer and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is always looming. And so this is really a testament, it's a litmus test to where the world and allies and the international community is willing to go. So I think understanding it in those terms is fundamental for understanding how to deal and engage with Palestine, not as an exceptional reality, but as you say, Hamza, as a reality that other groups, indigenous people, marginalized communities, and minorities are also struggling with.
Thank you very, very much, Tareq, both for those remarks and also for your participation in the panel. Omar, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say just to those who are joining that maybe aren't as familiar with this conversation and maybe some of what you heard you couldn't follow, or, I would just say, I encourage you to read more. I think there was a list of some resources that was provided, but, let this be the starting point for your journeys. I mean, take what we all said and do your own research and come to your own conclusions. I mean, you're all debaters, so you do this, for a living, but really, just, or for not for a living, but, for entertainment or for advancement. But my point is just, really take the time to research these things. Read the Human Rights Watch report, read some of the things that Mariam and Tareq and others have written, and come to your own conclusions. But it's important that you come to your own conclusions and that you go through that journey. And the second point that I want to make, and I'll end on this, is to say, to find the courage to break through the everyday conversation. People are doing it, right? You're not going to be on your own. I mean, we've seen a real shift in the conversation take place. When you say apartheid, you're saying something that Israeli human rights groups are saying. You're saying something that South Africa and Namibia are saying. You're saying something that two former Israeli ambassadors to South Africa, the former UN Secretary General. So be emboldened. Be courageous. Don't be afraid in debate discussions or in discussions with colleagues to be afraid to use the terminology and the analysis that's right. Because again, shifting the analysis is key to recognition, and recognition is key to action. And it's on all of us to kind of break through the barriers and having the courage to speak out. And if people like Mariam, who live it every day, can do that and have that courage with their lives on the line, I think the rest of us can do so.
Thank you so much, Omar, and thank you to Tareq, Omar, Mariam, more generally for such an intelligent, comprehensive, and yet compact discussion on Palestine. I think I'll just end with saying to the broader global debate community, perhaps, that the bar for complicity can no longer be whether you are actively participating in a community suffering. Because I think perhaps many of my friends who debate in Europe, perhaps many of my friends who debate in Israel think that is the bar, that as long as I don't support oppression, I am not an oppressor. Perhaps the bar needs to change there to, do you actively stand against oppression for the sake of those communities? And perhaps that's a discussion that the debating community will have more in the future. Having said that, thank you to the panel. Thank you, Zaina. Thank you, Alia, for organizing this on the local end. Thank you so much, Lucia, insofar as the participation of the European Debating Championship is concerned, for helping platform this discussion. And I think that is pretty much it. Good afternoon, good evening, or good night, wherever you are. And we will hopefully see you again soon.
Thanks, Hamza.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, we're gonna have a quick break before the How to Debate and Judge Palestine session starts in about 10 minutes.